I'm Marwan Bukhari. I'm a rheumatologist in Morecambe Bay. I'm the editor-in-chief of Rheumatology, and I'm also a member of the Heberden Committee. And I'll be talking to you a bit about abstracts as we're going along.
Hello, my name is Chris Winkup. I'm a clinical research fellow at UCL, and I'm also chair of the BSR trainee committee. I'm also a member of the Heberden committee, and I'll be talking a little bit about the abstracts in general and some basic science tips.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Polly Livermore. I'm a paediatric matron at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, and I'm the clinical academic lead at Great Ormond Street for nurses and allied health professionals. I'm the paediatric nurses rep for the UK, and I'm an associate editor for Advances in Rheumatology.
Great. So I think I'm going to be kicking off by talking a bit about general tips for the abstract submission for this year. So for those of you who don't know, BSR is planning to take place in Glasgow and online as a hybrid event next year from the 25th to 27th of April. Abstract submission will actually open on the 16th of August. So abstract submissions are available now and will close on the 13th of October at 5 p.m. So the abstracts are open now. If you'd like to get your abstracts going, then now is the ideal time to think about things. It will need to be submitted online via the BSR website, and we'll be providing a link for that shortly. Now, in terms of general guidelines, there is no limit to the number of abstracts that you are able to submit, so please feel free to submit as many as you so desire. The word limit when submitting is 450 words. If you have to, or if you decide to add a table, that will take 100 words out. So you'll be submitting a table and 350 words. The recommendation is no references. If you do add any references into your abstract, they will be removed. And it's important to remember to include any ethical agreements that have been put in place with regards to this. So if your study does require ethical approval, make sure you mention that. And similarly, if you're talking about cases or a case series, it's important to make sure that patient consent is included, and there is information on this on the website. Some of the things can take a while to fill in. Make sure that you include your fellow authors and their institutions. This can take up an awful lot of time. I always find it takes longer than expected. So start preparing your abstracts now, and you can start pre-populating some of the work now, even before moving on to the main text of your abstract. You will be asked to select a category, and it always surprises me there's such a wide array of possible categories that you can submit to. This includes sections on education, case reports, COVID, pediatric rheumatology, as well as audit and quality improvement. So it's not just the science. There's a whole host of things that can be submitted. As you work your way through the online submission, you'll need to include 3 key words. So keep them broad, keep them loosely attached to what your work is doing on. This can sometimes be useful for helping to find abstract reviewers. So make sure it really is central to the topic that you're focused on. As I mentioned, there is a section for authors and institutions. Think in advance, make sure that you have asked your colleagues if they're going to be involved. Make sure that you have enough time to share the abstract with them prior to actually hitting submit. It's a common problem to get very close to the deadline and suddenly be having to chase people for approval. So think now and start contacting your co-authors if you're going to be including them. Remember that each author will also need to have their conflict of interest signed off for the submission. Now, this is something that you can do as the submitting author, but it's important as, again, this can be a last-minute rush if you leave things too late to chase everyone's possible declarations. And these include things like research funding and additional things like this. So do make sure that you bear that in mind if you're contacting your co-authors at this early stage. When it comes to the body of the actual abstract itself, as I mentioned, it's 450 words, and it will be loosely divided into a section on background or aims, a section on methods, a section for results and conclusions. You're allowed to submit 1 table, but as I mentioned, this will deduct from the word count 100 words, so you'll be submitting 350 words and a table. The final sections will include any funding relating to the research, and clearly in many cases that's not required, but make sure you have those details available. And then you're entitled to review everything before you submit. So I suggest abstracts are open now. Have a look, think about what can be submitted, contact your co-authors, and start working on things fairly early. And so those are the overall tips for considering. And I'll now pass on to the next section.
It's me really telling you about the do's and don'ts of what you do with an abstract. And I remember when you're starting your abstract, in your background, some people tend to use up a lot of words to tell people who will be reading the abstract what they already know. So make sure that you understand that the person reading your abstract will have been chosen for their interest in the 3 keywords that you've already put in. So, and therefore, starting at the beginning to say rheumatoid arthritis is a chronic disease affecting 1% of the population isn't really something that will do anything except use up quite a lot of your numbers of letters, of words that you can do. But if you're saying, for example, rheumatoid arthritis has got significant psychological morbidity, and this is what has been shown in the past, that actually hooks people in, and then people know what your abstract is going to be about. So explaining at the very beginning to say, here is the background, here's what is known, and here is how it's going to lead very naturally to the aim, objective of what I'm going to do is what's important. And we very frequently will see abstracts where people will use up a lot of words at the very beginning, introducing a concept that people already know, but without telling me why this led to the person doing the research that they're about to do. So a great example is COVID. Everybody says COVID-19 is an epidemic. It did this, that, and the other. It killed a lot of people, etc. And then there is no link at all between that and saying, you know, I am reporting on 3 cases of post-COVID connective tissue disease, vasculitis, this, that, or the other. And that's something that you see quite a lot, that we have what we call the just nothing linking what's happened in the background with what is linked with what the aim. So if you're going to be starting, let's say, with a case report, let's say something happened, you had an acute problem, you had a case of something happening with the causality, you say, well, numerous reports have mentioned that, for example, this disease happens after the vaccine, or this disease happens after COVID. However, none have mentioned that, you know, somebody has got, you know, left-sided little finger gout, for example, and you wish to report on the first case of left-sided, you know, little finger gout in patients post-COVID. This is just an example. I won't say that would be accepted, but that's something that you'll be looking at to sort of like do. And when you actually take something like that, you actually see that it flows very nicely, that the background of what you're doing flows into the aim and objective of it. Then usually the reviewer will be looking at it going, okay, I can understand what has happened, I understand what's done, and then the judgment can be made whether it's, you know, whether to mark it up or down. And that's quite an interesting one. Going on to the objective really needs to be exceptionally clear. So let's say you're evaluating, you know, an audit of X happening throughout time, or an audit of the uptake of, you know, the uptake of a screening prior to rituximab infusions, or anything that you would be looking at, you know, when you're having it. It needs to be very carefully said, I wish, you know, this is what I wanted to do, and I specifically did it in the, you know, or to look at it within the last year or within a period of time, to be as specific about what you've done as possible in your aim. Because what people will want to see is the aim been actually looked at in the methods. So did you use the right method to address the aim? So it really needs to build as a bit of a story, that this is what's happened, this is what the background is, therefore this led me to the aim. To fulfill this aim, this led me to this method, and then I took this method, and here's how I did it in a bit of detail, to say I looked at all of the, you know, looked at all of the charts, I looked at all of the cases on a database, I did whatever it is that you did, and then this is how I report, you know, this is how I looked at it, this is how I looked at doing this, doing any descriptions. And it doesn't need to be complicated. All you need to have it is to basically to say, let's say I counted all the number of, all of the white cell counts that were done in a patient who's starting methotrexate, for example, and here is what I found. That's quite more than enough. You don't have to really put in lots of complicated statistics if you don't need to, especially if you're just counting something to make a point. And that's what's important from that point of view. And you really can be very nicely descriptive about what method you use. You reviewed case notes, you went and looked at databases, even if you've gone and looked at statistics, or you've been in a lab and been doing something more complicated, it doesn't necessarily matter, as long as you describe exactly what you did. So somebody who's reading it can say, okay, I get what's happening, let's see if the results are going to be interesting. And that takes it through to the results. And when you look at your results, you're going to be looking to see how well they're presented. And the important thing that I find with results is people tend to very frequently miss out the basics. The basics are, who are the people that you looked at? What's the population that you looked at? Do they look like a patient I see in the clinic? Is there a, right mix of age, right genders, right, does this look like the sort of patient I see? Therefore, can I relate this to something clinical? Or if you're describing, anything else, you have to be able to describe your baseline of where you went to and how you managed to do it. The vast majority of cases, some people will look at, let's say they've followed up a group of patients over time. And one of the things that's always missing in some of these abstracts is people will say, we started off with 1,000 patients, and then they don't tell you how many patients ended the X number of years follow-up. And that's always, it's always a case that will make you go, I'm not sure that this is the right way of describing the cohort. So let's say you had 1,000 families. I'm not mentioning the Northeast, but that's where they have 1,000 family work. And then they followed them up over time. And I think there's not that many of them left now. You want to be able to say, here's the number that was left, and here's the ones that we analyzed and we looked to answer the question. And the question has to sort of like be answered quite nicely. One of the things that we see very frequently is that the aim isn't answered by the results. So you actually will go look back and say, hang on, these people have actually they've lost their way somewhere. Their aim was this, but they did this analysis, which is quite interesting, but quite different. So therefore, the abstract doesn't actually flow and doesn't make sense. And I think having somebody look at your abstract to make sure that flow is there, that the train of thought from the background to the aims and objectives, to the methods, to the results, follows through very nicely. And the last bit that I was going to sort of mention in a bit of detail is looking at the conclusions. And within conclusions, you don't want to repeat the result. What you want to say is this: what does this mean? What piece of what do I want to tell you is really nice and important, and quite a nice message. Be it that you can actually improve your clinical work with your patients by actually having a performer, let's say. So you introduced a new form that ensures that nobody slips through the net when they're starting medication, or whether or not you've sort of like observed that something interesting happens in a cohort of rare patients that you've got. Doesn't necessarily matter, but you have to say what this means and what it adds to what's already known on the subject. And doing that will basically completely and utterly ensure that you can actually then look at an abstract and it makes a nice story. And that's what usually makes people start to score it higher up. Remember, most abstract scorers, it doesn't matter where they are, will score it on a 5-point scale. And the 5-point scale is 5 is great, this is really novel and really good. The vast majority of the abstracts score between 2 and 3, which is like good, interesting stuff, really good, solid work that we really want to be seeing. And it's the abstracts that score lower than that are the ones that are very frequently not accepted into the meetings. And the only reason that would happen is that if you don't actually follow that flow, that's when the abstract reviewers will say, no, that hasn't happened. The only other thing I was going to mention within there is that very frequently your abstract reviewers will have reviewed for other meetings. And so be very, very wary that if there's something that is you've already presented, let's say which was done at the ACR or at QLAR, and you're basically redoing it again, the chances are people will go, hang on, this is very, very similar to what you've done. And so if you do something that's very similar, but you think you've added a bit more work to it from the last time, make sure that you mention it. Be very upfront about it. Say, listen, this is, I reported at EULAR this, and then I have added some more patients on, and I found something different, or I found an additional piece of information, or this affirms things or makes things better. And I think that's important as well to keep doing. And there's lots and lots of tips of what else you can do, but that's really the broad overview of what you can do within there. And I'll sort of like lead on to sort of like say to Polly and say, you might want to sort of like add on more bits to that.
Thanks, Marwan. So I was asked specifically to highlight to you about titles. So titles are really, really important and often not given the consideration that actually they need. So you've done an amazing piece of work, or you've done a service development, or you've done something that you want to share with everybody. And that's the whole point of an abstract, is it's that dissemination and it's getting your work out there. And so your title ideally should draw people's interest in. Your title needs to be quite clear and quite concise. So you need keywords in there that when your abstract is published, people can find your abstract and can find your work from the keywords. So don't go too far off piste, but try and keep them kind of descriptive. Would really help at getting your work noticed. And when you think about the next stage on from an abstract, is some of the abstracts will be talks and some will be posters. So you don't want too long a title that then it takes up half your poster when it's on there. But you also want your poster, your title on there to draw an interest for the people. That's the first thing they notice when they look at your poster. That's the first bit that people read because of the bigger weighting of it. So you want your title to give people the idea of what you're going to be talking to them about. And so think about your title. And get the rest of the authors on your abstract submission to check it as well, to check that they're happy. And I think that's really important. And I think Chris alluded to it, but giving time for the other people that you're asking to be on your work with you to make comments on your draft and to send it back to you and listen to their comments that they've said to you. You should get your friends and family to read it and check it makes sense. As Marwan specifically said, it should be a story of what you've done. It should be really clear from kind of start right through to end. And I think that's really important. If you follow the guidelines, then most of these abstracts will be accepted through. So yeah, I think that's it from me. Anything to add, Chris, that I've missed?
Asked to talk a little bit about perhaps more basic science type abstracts, and I think that this is a slightly different area that I may be speaking to only a small group of people, but I think some of the things that I'm going to say may apply to perhaps some of the more clinical research. So with regards to basic science, I think what you need to bear in mind is many of the people who are going to be reviewers may not understand what some of the techniques being used are. So people often fall into a trap in basic science of trying to be perhaps a bit too clever, presuming too much and saying we did this big technique in patients. And as Marwan was saying, lots of people know about the underlying clinical illness. You don't need to use words to describe the condition you looked at. But in particular in basic science, you may want to give a little bit more information with regards to the techniques being used. Bear in mind that people may not be familiar with some of these, and you might want to use a little bit of the words in your background and introduction to kind of explain what the technique is and why it's important. I think a general rule to go for not just basic science, but any abstract being submitted is think about where the strength is. So if you've used a really interesting new scientific technique that no one else has ever used before, it's worth mentioning that. However, if you're using something that's been used fairly frequently, but you've done it in multiple patients, hundreds or thousands of patients, and your strength is you've tested it in 10 times as many patients as anyone else has, then that's kind of where the novelty lies. People often will fall into the trap of just describing what they've done, and it's very hard to kind of see where the actual strengths of the research comes from. So in terms of a title, I think it's important, if the key thing is you've done this in 2,000 patients, that needs to be in the title as much as it being basic scientific research. If what you're doing is more than anyone else has done, make sure that's in the title, make sure that's emphasized. In your introduction, make sure that you introduce what the technique is, what it's going to tell you beyond what people would usually understand. Are you using a new technique? Are you using something in a different way? Are you using it a way of defining things differently? And then in the conclusion, again, I think as it was alluded to previously, it's important to bring this all together. It's useful, given that many of the people reviewing the abstracts will be clinicians. If you've done something heavily basic science, but it tells you something that may translate to clinical practice, for example, you found an antibody or a cell type that relates to a particular response to treatment, then make sure that's emphasized. Make sure you can say how what you're doing, albeit in a lab or looking at cells, may translate clinically. Bear in mind that it's a lot. It may be clinicians who have not been in a lab who are reading this, and you need to bring them up to date with regards to what the translational element of the research is. And again, one of the things I think is a key difference is many people will be trying to use various diagrams to demonstrate how clever their techniques are, whether they're looking at different cells, microscope images, flow cytometry, and things like this. But you don't have that luxury. So there is only options for a table. So you need to make sure that you're describing in your results things in the way as best as possible, as you're not going to have that nice diagram to fall back onto it to really show what you've done. So kind of key things for basic science. Make sure you emphasize in your title why this is important and different. In your introduction, make sure that you're explaining to people what the technique actually involves and why it's interesting. Don't waste time talking about the disease that you're studying and you're studying. In the methods, again, bring people up to date with what it is that you've done and keep it concise. Don't forget the clinical importance that we did describe. How reflective is this population of the population as a whole? So include information on perhaps disease activity and treatment as briefly as possible. In your results, describe through what it is that you've got, but without the added use of a diagram. So make sure that if things are statistically significant, you show that. If you're going to use a table, make sure that does a lot of the work. And then in conclusion, it can be useful to kind of reiterate why this is novel, whether you've done it in more patients, whether it's a new technique, and importantly, what it might mean for clinical practice. And keep that in mind as you're probably going to be having people with a more clinical background reviewing what you're looking at.
To add to that, regarding when you're looking at things like health services research, audit, and anything else, some of the important things are exactly the same. If you're going to, with looking at tables, if you're looking at differences between populations, use things like asterisks to denote where there's a difference between your two populations. That will show up in the paper. Somebody just looking at the table can actually see a difference. And you can use that later on to actually have different background colors in your table when you put it onto a poster to make it look much, much prettier. And you can use things like that from that point of view. Always think beforehand. Maybe you could might be wanting to be looking at, things that you might want to put into the poster that you actually write at the same time as you write your abstract. Because a flow diagram occasionally will look very, very nice on a poster and will attract somebody who's walking past you at the meeting to actually come and say, and this is quite interesting, how did you manage to do this from that point of view? And how can you show that this will actually make things better? And if you're looking at service improvement, a lot of our trainees are doing, and everybody is doing service improvement projects. Really showing that as a bit of a cycle is actually a very good idea, to actually say who your stakeholders were, how you put them all in the room, how you came up with an idea, how you've actually implemented that, how you're going to assess it. It really all has to flow very nicely into what you managed to do. And it's fairly simple to actually look at something that's fairly well conducted and thought out and be able to do the thought processes. One of the things that I try and do myself is actually, if you show one of your abstracts to a lay person, how would they understand what you did? And if you can take that step backwards from your abstract and show it to somebody to say, does this make sense? And very frequently people will say, I didn't understand that bit, or you didn't understand this bit, and this is how you worded it. That's a very good thing to do. And one of the last things that people do a lot of is use very long and complicated sentences. So if you start a sentence at one place with lots of commas, howevers, possiblies and maybes and therefores, etc. By the time you get to the end of the sentence, you forget what the beginning of the sentence that was actually going to say. So make sure that you actually do have that ability to look at the structure in your style and in the grammar as well. But being able to describe something that you've done in 450 or maybe 350 words in a table is actually quite generous. Other meetings will take 250 words maximum. And so we've actually got a fairly good way of being able to get successful abstracts in, especially within the meeting. And remember that every single abstract will be seen by between 3 and 5 people. So, there's going to be multiple eyes looking at it from fairly different ways. So you might want to be able to make it that this is fairly objective. So the things like, I had one patient who had 1 dose of the vaccine, then they got really bad COVID. Therefore, the vaccine causes COVID is a great one that you see a lot of. That is not a valid conclusion. It's not science to say so. Everybody's getting the vaccine. Some people get COVID. What you want to be able to say within that is important. So over egging what you've found is something that you should really not do, and you definitely don't want to embellish what's there. And remember to use words like this could be or possibly is, rather than saying, this is definitely the cause. I've got this, therefore this caused this. That usually irritates your reviewers, and they won't really like what you've written. And you'll get quite a lot of, pushback when you're writing an abstract like that. Just make sure that it's actually fairly fair and balanced. Just to go back to what Chris said earlier, just making sure that you've got ethical approval or you've got permission from all of your co-authors to write is very important, and they've actually had a look at it. Starting early and putting everybody in the system before you even circulate the abstracts around to your co-authors is always good practice. We don't all do it. We all have a scramble, and in the last day before the abstract submission shuts, you suddenly get a flurry of abstracts, and you can see the ones that have been done quickly because they're the ones that might have a good idea, but they're not been well sort of like deliberated and looked at in a lot of detail. And we always try and sort of like say, well, that could have actually been quite a good poster or a good abstract or a good talk to do that. And remember, when we get to the plenary, the best selected abstracts usually go on to there, and they're from a variety of places, and they're not just all clinical science or basic science. There's lots of service improvement, lots of everything actually goes into there. And the last thing I was going to mention was about how you use quotes in qualitative research. And so you've got lots of people when they start to with qualitative research, the idea is you get a focus group, you put all of the words, you put all the words into there, and then you analyze the themes. But people tend to stop telling us what the themes that were analyzed are doing and start to quote specific patients a lot. And therefore you forget what the theme was by the time you get to the conclusion. So just make sure that you actually talk about the themes earlier on within the abstract, and just make sure that the quotes either reinforce what the themes are or actually help the reader understand where your conclusion will be going, especially when you're doing something qualitative, because people like quoting what the patient said. So patients will say, I felt like this is the worst thing that could have happened, etc., etc. And what we're looking for to an extent is what are the themes? Is there something that's coming out when you're chatting to patients, that there are things that concern them? And that's an important element of it all. Pippa, do you have any more?
I think it's just picking up on one point from reviewing last year, the importance that I think Marwan mentioned. Don't just copy and paste an old abstract. It's very easy to do. It was quite easy for us to spot, and it's very easy to work out because you just copy and paste it into Google and you see the same thing come up presented elsewhere. So it's important that if you've got something new and novel, make sure you change it up. We did have quite a few in the session that I was looking at last year that were carbon copies already presented elsewhere. And this is a mistake I think people can fall into, in particular if you're not thinking about things in advance. You kind of get to within a day or two of the deadline and think, oh, I wanted to submit that thing. I've kind of made an abstract about that before. Well, I'll just submit the same thing and I'll change it all up when it's been accepted. That's pretty easy to actually identify. So make sure that you've given yourself plenty of time. Make sure you change things if there are new things. You reanalyze things in a different way, and that way you won't get caught out.
We'll always ask is, when abstracts are submitted, especially to the British Society, do we have limits on what gets taken in and what isn't? The answer is usually if it depended on space. But now we've got virtual posters, that the space isn't the big thing that is happening, but we are looking at what the themes are. And when we look at how, people will submit a lot about rheumatoid arthritis, you've got several sections that aren't very well subscribed, like epidemiology, osteoporosis, for example. But there's still, if there's good enough abstracts going in, then we things will be looked at quite fairly. And you do have hawks and doves when people are reviewing the abstracts, and very frequently within the committee we moderate quite a lot of them and say, hang on, despite it scoring low, this is actually quite a good abstract. So don't always think that we won't be looking at them again. Lots of eyes will have cast them, will have been over your abstract several times before you get this is actually quite a good effective thing. I think it's a good message to give to the wider rheumatology community. And remember, it doesn't matter what you can submit on almost everything that you've sort of been involved with, whether it's cases, health services research, audit, quality improvement, clinical research. Even some people will submit things including very good systematic reviews on something that's important, and these are all just can happen. You can actually go and look at seeing what's published and synthesize that very nicely into an abstract. But if you don't tell us why that is the case, then it doesn't usually make that much sense. So a good example being, sorry, I keep going back to COVID because we've had quite a lot of COVID happening. One of my trainees went and decided early on in the day, saying that tocilizumab sat, there's lots of case reports. If I put them all together, do you think this will be of interest? And the answer is yes. And the synthesis of those case reports has actually, gotten into a publication for her. And because it was a valid, well-reasoned argument that maybe tocilizumab might work for COVID, it's been cited several times. So she's really, been very pleased with that. So that's just an example of where you can get what's already published, put it together and do it. So it's not really something just for the researchers and everybody else. Everybody can do it. And, we've got everything, allied health professionals, medical students, everybody from around, the community really should be able to submit an abstract without being scared that it won't get accepted, I think is an important message.
The other thing we've not mentioned is the great thing about the BSR, which is the abstract competition and the kind of chance to win an abstract award. I'm not sure how many awards they give, but if you submit an abstract that the reviewers think is particularly of a worthy quality, then it increases your risk of winning such an award.
And there's going to be a link towards the awards. So if you've got medical students around, if you've got anybody, especially you work with the basic scientists, you've got anybody around, the awards are there, and people are very infrequently don't apply for them thinking they won't be able to be eligible for them, but they are there, and they would try and give them out as much as possible when people do apply for the prizes. So that does happen as well.
subject, the link should have just been posted, and I definitely encourage anyone who's got any medical students working on prizes to encourage them to submit, purely for the conflict of interest that I think I submitted and won the medical student prize more than a decade ago, I think now. But it was really great because it comes with the opportunity for the student to go to the conference. And one of the main things we're looking to do is encourage more people into this profession. So if you do have students who are interested in submitting things, then please do point them towards it, as it may give them the opportunity to present their results at the conference and inspire the next generation of people to come through.
One of the other things that we haven't mentioned is that once you've got your abstract put together, you might start to think about how you can actually put the thoughts behind the abstract and all the research into a 3-minute talk, if you like. How can you pitch your entire piece of work in 3 minutes? The important thing about this is that this is frequently the best way that somebody comes and chats to you at the meeting, or somebody listens to your presentation if it's pre-recorded. And then somebody will be able to help you with the networking elements of it, or if somebody's really interested in that branch of research and wants to collaborate, they will want to come and make sure that you're on the same wavelength from that point of view. And so being able to communicate it as well in a 3-minute conversation is actually quite an interesting one. You should really be looking to get yourselves geared towards being able to do what's called the elevator pitch. Sorry to use an Americanism. But that's what people talk about, is that you can actually go and sell what you've done, so that maybe other people can do it. They can collaborate. You can put 2 sets of patient data sets together and come up with a bigger answer and make for a very good thing there. Yes, and I can completely see, that you can get education awards, about the RCN Rheumatology Nurse Competency Framework, which is a very important bit, and it's just one of these things that if you communicate about it, people will take interest, and it might just tie into either science or politics or, education or any of the other elements that the BSR are doing, including external relations. So it's important for people to do that. Any final points from everybody before we go through for questions at all?
If I could give just a few tips, I think having reviewed a few abstracts, it's the ones that are simple, translatable, and where you can see where someone's interest has come from to do the abstract. Those are the things that kind of really sell it. Don't make things overly complicated. Keep it simple. Show why you've done it. Show what it means. I think those are the ones that come across best.
And I think an enthusiasm is a good idea. Sorry.
Well, the only thing I was going to say is build on what Chris said, which if anyone is considering submitting an abstract, then I think bite the horns really and do so.
The question that I was going to give to the two other panelists was actually going to be, if you've got an abstract, if you've got an idea in your head and you're not sure, you're in a clinical place and there's nobody around who can guide you, who would you go for help?
Good question. I think as a trainee, I've often kind of found that it's difficult to kind of know where to get a sounding board from. I'd say you don't just need to speak about your ideas to people senior than you. I think sometimes speaking to people on your level, so I know that training days are a bit difficult these days with everything being virtual, but speaking to your colleagues, I find speaking to my SHO and house officers helpful, just to kind of use that as a way of explaining kind of what my ideas are, without being able to pull things together. And I think sometimes explaining things, you kind of feel like you have to go more senior. You have to ask someone who's perhaps got loads of experience, but actually trying to explain why you find something interesting and what you found interesting to someone perhaps who's more of a novice at things actually gets you in the flow of communicating things in a bit of a better way for the abstract. So seek out colleagues on your level, speak to your juniors, speak to anyone who'll listen, really.
What do you think, Polly?
Yeah, I completely agree. I do. I think you get a lot of support from your peers, definitely, and from organisational support groups across the UK. You know, other people who might be doing something similar in a different centre that you want to bounce ideas off, and family and friends. Really, you know, speak to kind of. There's lots of places you can go to for help and support, and to ask kind of people. But yeah, definitely speak to the people around you, and I'm sure there'll be a champion in your centre where you work. There'll be someone who is fully prepared to support you and encourage you to submit. Definitely.
And
Or come to you, Marwan.
well, most people are quite happy to be approached, actually, and there isn't usually any problem at all in somebody coming and saying, you know, how would this be? What's interesting here? How would I take this idea forward? And I think there's going to be quite a few sessions coming up for those of you attending. Hopefully, there's going to be a session called Research for Everyone, which we're working on, and that's going to be able to just showcase how it doesn't really matter where you're working. You can actually then take an idea and do it. And hopefully we'll have some roundtable discussions from medical students, from allied health professionals, from everybody who have done different bits of research from fairly unorthodox places. They've taken the idea and they've run with it, and they've actually done quite well as they're going along. So watch the space. It's going to be hopefully at the AGM one in Glasgow. And it will probably work better face to face, but we will be doing it hybrid. So we'll see how it works out.
I think someone has mentioned that the need for support is a good reason for having patient involvement. I think this is something that I've seen a little bit more often now, and I think that again is something really important. Going back to the basic science point of view, you can be as clever as you want looking at the one cell that interests you, but if you can't communicate how that's going to make a difference for patients, it's going to be very hard to make your abstract stand out. So I think speaking to patients, I know even when I'm trying to consent people to studies, having patients interested, and we've got some really great patient partners who have helped us develop our research, is a really important thing. And having been involved with some patient research, it really does give it an extra dimension. So on that point, I would recommend, if you have got patients who have been involved in substantial amounts of work with your abstract, then you might want to be considering dropping them an email if they've been involved substantially for authorship as well. And again, you'll get a good perspective in a very different way from that. So if you've done patient-based research and that patients have been heavily involved, make sure that they get involved if you're considering submitting an abstract with them in it.
And Polly, have you written with parents as well as patients?
Yeah, definitely. I've had some parents who are on my expert panel, and so they're excellent at reading an abstract and checking that the message is clear, that you're not using jargon and abbreviations and terminology which you assume people know that not necessarily everybody would know, and that it's relevant as well, that the work we're doing is relevant and it goes full circle. So it's not just bench to bedside, but bench to bedside and back again, so that it involves everybody all the way through. Definitely. I mean, the other tip I definitely think about is looking at previous abstracts that have been submitted. So maybe going to last year's publications and seeing how the abstracts have been worded, especially if you can find an abstract that's similar to what you're thinking along the same vein of what you want to submit this year. See if you can get some tips from those.
I mean, every website will say, go and look at what's been published before, but very frequently people just might not want to be able to do that. So yes, there is that. And thanks, Rebecca. But one of the things I've done, for example, is we did a patient-reported experience measure, and we included NRAS. And so the first author of that was Elsa Bosworth, who actually we then went on to publish that, and it's been taken as an example of how to measure a patient experience in rheumatology outpatients, which is one of the things that you can do with your patients and be very successful at. And if anybody wants to be doing things like that to ensure that the quality of care that's provided is actually there for the patients, it's there, it's out in the public domain. And just engaging patients is always one of the better ideas. Right, so I asked my pre-prepared question. What about yourselves? Do you have anything that you would want to ask?
I have one question I often think about, but I don't know the answer actually, so I'm not sure if either of you two know. But when you submit an abstract, will you hear about your abstract before the early bird finishes to register for the conference? Do you know?
Usually, yes, I think, but I'll wait for our BSR colleagues to answer that one. Chris, do you know?
I don't want to get the BSR in any trouble. I'm sure they'll say something on the chat very soon. Yes, we will hear in December. Yeah, actually, I read that earlier. I think that's in time for you still to qualify for the early bird registration. And again, just emphasizing on the point that I think it's when you submit your abstract, you can also say if you want to be considered for any awards. And I think that's a good idea. If you fulfill a category, then why not put yourself forwards?
And can you say whether you want to do a poster or an oral presentation? Chris, do you know?
Yes, you can. So there's a question saying if you were to report a case series as opposed to one case, do you need permission from all the patients? Unfortunately, you do. And we've had lots of really good cases come through where things have not gone as well and you didn't manage to consent the patient. And although there's lessons learned that you want to do, because there's no consent, you can't do it. However, you can occasionally talk to the relatives and do that. So we'll be looking there. There's a good message from Isabella saying all eligible abstracts will be considered for awards, so no need to apply specifically for them. So if you've got a abstract submitted to the SSR for the upcoming autumn meeting, the answer is unless there's something new, people might find it. If it's a regional meeting that's not where the meeting gets published, so basically the proceedings, if they're out there in the public domain, you can't submit it more than once. But if it's just your regional, your local rheumatology colleagues, and you're presenting it, and it's not out in the public domain as being minuted, then fine, you can resubmit it. Can a medico do case report of his or her own disease or surgery? Of course, the patient perspectives are fantastically good. And you might have seen the BMJ recently, where we had a very prominent rheumatologist write a very, very touching story about his journey with motor neuron disease. And it was quite good because it was done from the point of view of somebody who was a rheumatologist all of his life, a very prominent one at that, and then developed motor neuron disease, and his experience with how things were getting worse with him were there, and it got published in the BMJ. So it's having an insight and being a clinician is always a good idea, and it does do that. People were really with a lot of empathy, going, is that what's going to be like when I fall ill, or if I fall ill? So it's usually it's very, very poignant, and people tend to. There's a lot of interest in that sort of thing. Let's have a look. More messages. That's great. Thank you. Right, we're sort of like getting towards the final end, looking at questions, etc. Any last comments or tips to anybody?
Answer this, maybe Marwan first, but people will either write a title that explains what's going on, or they'll try and put some puns in it and make it a bit more eye-catching. What do you think is the right one to do?
I think although puns are quite good, I don't think that works as well in my head. I mean, I've been to an EULA before where you had somebody dressed as a samurai with a sword in front of their poster. I think that's a bit gimmicky. If you really want to make a point about it was giant cell arteritis, I think you really want to be able to say, I want to make a scientific point. I'll turn that question and say, should you use a question as your abstract title? And people are divided into that. If your abstract answers the question, then fine. But if your abstract doesn't, then asking it as a question as a title is not really very meaningful. That's my opinion. But I'll open it up. Polly, what do you think?
I agree. I think an abstract, a title that clearly says what you're doing is better than something that's too abstract and too out there, because I think sometimes people can stand there and try and work out your title without actually reading your abstract.
And always remember, at the meeting, people will read the title of your abstract and your conclusion, and will only go back and read the rest of what you've done if you've managed to hook them with those two things. So you've got to hook them with the beginning and with the end as well. Right. Any more questions? Polly, did you have a question for us at all?
I asked my question. I suppose, okay, I'm going to ask you both your one top tip that you'd like the audience to go home with today. What would be the one thing you'd like them to remember? Marwan?
I'll start with this, with what I call, you have to be clear, you have to be concise, you have to be precise. That's very bizarre. There goes CCP, not antibodies. So clear, concise, precise, and punchy. And if you manage to get all of that into your abstract, I think you'll not have a problem having it succeed and go to the meetings and then translate to the posters and the papers or the talks and the papers as you're going along.
Whether you're looking at clinical research or the basic science stuff, I think people are going to be looking at your abstract saying, what's this going to tell me differently in terms of practice? How will I think about patients differently? Whether you've designed a different way of caring for your patients, whether you found a new cell that means their treatment is different. I think having that translational thing that brings it all back to clinical practice is the thing that probably catches quite a lot of attention for people.
Okay, there's a question here about limits and rules to be put in place to prevent over-editing and overthinking the abstract. I can start with my thoughts on that. The first thought is, if you've got enough time, leave it alone for a couple of days and then come back and read it and see if it makes sense. That's the first one. The second is always show it to somebody else. Just make sure that it's, that it reads okay, etc. And the third one that I would do is if you go and show it to a lay person and ask them, what do they think this abstract tells them? And if they actually get it, then you don't need to actually go back and re-edit it. You've done the right thing. Polly, you're being asked specifically for it.
I'll just finish Teresa. So I think it's really important because words are so tight, although as we've said, BSR actually is very generous, but really each sentence that's in there needs to be in there for a purpose. So when you've written your abstract, and you're probably still going to be struggling for words, just go back and check each sentence that it actually makes sense and that it helps tell your story. And for me, my top tip is start early. Really start early, even if you're just storyboarding with a pencil and a blank piece of paper, but working out what your story is and allowing yourself plenty of time so you're not literally
if I can just say something on that kind of
final
rules,
cut-off time.
to prevent over editing. Be mindful of the word count. Obviously, don't go spilling over in your first draft and then have to delete half of it and then end up with loads of sentences just stuck together that don't make sense. And please, when you're sharing it with your fellow authors, make sure they're mindful of what the word count is, as it can get quite tricky if someone sends back an edited version and they've had an extra 200 words in. So try and make sure that you emphasize what the word count is, or you end up having to draft, redraft, and send back.
Somebody always asks, is it better to have a lot of authors or just one or two authors within there? And the answer is it depends on the topic. If it's something that's a multi-regional collaboration, of course you put everybody in and make sure that a few key people will be able to comment on it. But if it's just yourself and two or three other people, which is the usual number of authors in an abstract, then that's absolutely fine. Usually if an abstract is just one person on their own, means that they've not really had the ability to bounce it off somebody else. So maybe look to see who might be a good co-author to give you some information on that. Right. Any other questions at all from the audience? That's good. And I think we'll just go back to our moderator, who will be telling us a bit more about more of the webinars that are going to be happening over time. Thank you, Dana. Right. Do we have some final words about the upcoming webinars that are going to be done? We also need to mention to you that there's going to be a link to some feedback. The BSR is very keen to have feedback regarding these webinars and how useful they are, and things going forward, how the team, including the education team, will be taking things forward on behalf of the BSR. So please let us know if there's any things that you feel would work, or would work as a webinar, would work as face-to-face meetings. I'm sure that the team will be able to try and organize them for you. Right. So just looking to see if there's anything else that's come through. Marina, or anybody else from the BSR team, anything else you wanted to mention? There you go.
Put a link of webinars in the chat.
Yeah. So have a look at the learning webinars, and there's going to be quite a few more looking at it. And if you actually want to be on the other side of reviewing, watch this space. The journal team are putting together a reviewing masterclass to teach you how to review abstracts. So you'll be looking, if you look out for this in the coming months, you'll be having that as a resource for you to use as BSR members. In which case, I think that will be thanks from everybody, and just thanking this BSR for us going on for an hour, and thanking all the speakers. Hopefully, you'll all be a bit happier submitting abstracts and making them successful at each of the every meetings. Thanks for listening.